Hello and welcome. We're once again in the studio with construction law expert Roger Knowles to discuss 4 more pivotal construction cases in this, the third part of our classic case law series.
Our first case is that of Rhinewood versus L. Brown and Sons, which was heard as an appeal in the House of Lords in 2008. The original case involved the granting of an extension of time to Brown, the contractor, after a withholding notice had already been issued and liquidated damages deducted by the client, Rhinewood. In the original case, the Court of Appeal found against Brown and ruled that the contractor had not had payment unfairly withheld.
Roger, warm welcome. Lovely to see you again. Now, liquidated damages are often incurred, aren't they, when a project overruns? What was particularly special about this case?
Well, this case involved Rhinewood, a developer, and Brown, who come from Wilmslow up in leafy Cheshire. And there are 3 things that you need to understand before you can appreciate what this case is all about. Firstly, if the employer wishes to deduct liquidated damages because the contract is finished late, the architect must issue a non-completion certificate, which states very simply the contractor failed to complete by the completion date in the contract or the extended completion date. Secondly, if the employer wishes to deduct the damages, he must send what's known as a withholding notice. The architect is certified, shall we say, £100,000, and there's a £10,000 deduction for liquidated damages. What the employer must do before knocking the money off is to write saying, I'm going to knock off £10,000 because you failed to complete on time, and the £10,000 is made up of 8 weeks or whatever. If those 2 documents are not in place, the employer cannot deduct the liquidated damages. There's a third thing which is important about this case. If the employer doesn't pay the main contractor within the payment period, which is 14 days from the date the architect issues the certificate, the contractor can serve a warning notice saying, look, you haven't paid me. If you don't pay me within 14 days, I'm going to leave the site and determine my employment. It goes on to say that if this happens once, where the employer doesn't pay on time and the contractor serves the warning notice, but he then ultimately does pay. If it happens a second time, the contractor doesn't need to serve the warning notice. He just says, I'm off because you haven't paid within the allotted timescale. So that's the little background, really. Now, in this case, there was a completion date for the construction of 59 flats of the 18th of October 2004. An extension of time was granted up to the 13th of December 2004, but the contractor still hadn't finished. There was a liability of £62,000 in liquidated damages. So the employer, obviously anxious to get his hands on the money, architects issues the non-completion of it, saying, I hereby certify that work wasn't completed by the 13th of December in accordance with the extended contract period which I've granted. He then issued a certificate. This was on the 11th of January 2005 for £189,000. The employer wanted to knock off the damages, so he had to send this withholding notice. So he writes saying, I'm going to knock off £62,000 from the architect certificate because you failed to complete on time, you were X weeks late at so much per week. Now, that was time moving on, and the final date for payment was the 25th of January. And on the 21st of January, the architect got a rush of blood to the head because he granted a further extension of time. Now, this further extension of time had a result that the liquidated damage figure was reduced from 62,000 down to 12. Anyway,
so the employer wasn't very happy about that, I shouldn't imagine.
No, the contractor was obviously a little concerned. He was happy with the extension of time, but the damages had been deducted at 62,000. He said, well, I want the balance paying. So the employer said, well, don't worry. He said, I'll send you a cheque by the 2nd of February. The contractor said, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. Because if you want to deduct liquidated damages at all and you've knocked off 62,000, then you must have a non-completion certificate which relates to the first extension of time. We've had one since. And you must have a withholding notice, again relating to the first extension of time, but we've had another one. So we don't have a non-completion certificate related to the second extension, nor do we have a withholding notice related to the second. But you've still knocked off 62,000. Now, we've had this problem with you before, you know. You didn't pay on time before we had to serve the warning notice. So we don't have to serve the warning notice now. You haven't paid us what you're due to pay us, and therefore we're determining, and we're off. And he left the site.
Right, well, I do hope everyone's keeping up with all of this. There will be questions
well, it's a complicated
later.
one. Yeah.
It is a bit, isn't it? But anyway, the case went all the way to the House of Lords. What did they say?
Well, I'll tell you what the lower court said first, because that's more, which is important, but it's more important, the House of Lords.
I was worried you might.
The lower court said, well, rules is rules, you know. And if you have a rule that says you can't knock off liquidated damage until you've got a valid non-completion certificate and a valid withholding notice, and these two were not valid because they relate to the first exchange of time and not the second. So the lower court, they agreed that the contractor was right. And they went to appeal. And the appeal court said, no, that's not right. Because when you get your first exchange of time and you get your non-completion certificate and you get your withholding notice, then the right to deduct liquidated damage crystallised at that point. So the employer could knock off damages. If subsequently he grants a further exchange of time, well, he can pay back the liquidated damages which are due for repayment within a reasonable time, which is what he did. So the Court of Appeal overturned the lower court. And then, to answer your question, we get cut into the chase.
Yes.
When we get House of Lords, they agreed with the Court of Appeal, and they said, well, the right to deduct liquidated damage has crystallised with the issue of the non-completion certificate related to the first exchange of time, and the withholding notice as well relates to the first exchange of time. So the employer won the case and the contractor lost.
And also Section 111 of the Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act had some bearing on this, didn't it?
Well, it did. Now, what used to happen in the good old days before the Act was that quite often the architect would certify, say, a couple of £100,000. The employer didn't pay the full £200,000, maybe he only paid 150, and the contractor wouldn't know why. And so the Act stated that the employer must, if he's not going to pay the amount certified, indicate why he's not paying the full amount. And if he doesn't indicate why he's not paying the full amount before the final date for payment, he's got to pay the full amount. So it becomes a very, very crucial document, and it satisfies the contractor that he knows at least why he's not been paid. It doesn't help the bank balance, but at least he knows why it hasn't been paid, even though he's not got the money.
But the upshot of all of this, Roger, does seem to be stick to your dates. Don't rely on an extension of time. Otherwise, you can expect to pay up.
I couldn't have put it better myself. Absolutely right.
Our second case deals with the problems which can arise where a unit rate in a contractor's tender proves to be well above what it should have been. In Henry Boot Construction versus Alstom Combined Cycles, Henry Boot was contracted to build a power station in Clwyd, Wales for Alstom. The power station consisted of 4 gas turbines, each with their own heat recovery steam generator, as well as a number of cooling towers. The turbines were housed in a turbine hall and the heat recovery generators in a separate building called the HGSR. The cooling towers were separated from the HGSR by a road. Alstom advised Boot that it was altering the contract to allow for the lowering of the power station's cold water pipes. Boot advised, and later confirmed in a fax to Alstom, the sum of £250,880 was to allow for additional and different temporary works only, required in the turbine hall.
So, Roger, a very clear quote for the work in the turbine hall there. What's wrong with that?
Well, the quotation, quite rightly, was extra work, and the extra work, according to the terms of the contract, should be based upon the prices built into the original price. Now, in this particular item of extra work, there was an awful lot of sheet piling. Now, the rate in the contract for sheet piling was £89 per square metre. It was double the normal rate. Boot had made an error. But nonetheless, they were quite happy to say, well, it's a contract rate. The fact that it's twice what it should be doesn't make any difference. We're going to charge the £89. Well, the bill for sheet piling was 2.3 million, which was £1 million more than it would have been if they'd charged the going rate. So obviously Alstom were not happy about that, and they said, well, we're not paying. And Boot said, well, if you don't pay, then we're going to have to take the matter to court and let the court decide.
But Boot gained an unfair additional payment.
Well, they gained an additional payment. Whether it was unfair or not is another matter. The court said that if you look at the wording in the contract, it says the contract rates apply, provided the work is of a similar character, executed under similar conditions. There was no question that the character or conditions would change, so therefore, following the letter of the contract, you get paid whatever price is in the contract. It was £89.
So that was the judgment. The payment had to be made. I mean, it does seem a bit unfair, though, doesn't it, when there was quite obviously a mistake made?
Well,
Does it ever work the other way around?
It goes the other way around sometimes. There was a case much earlier than this involving Dudley Corporation and Parsons and Morin. Now, in the contract, there was an item for excavating 750 cubic yards, but back in the old days now, 750 cubic yards of rock. And the contractor priced this at 2 shillings per cubic yard, when it should have been £2 per cubic yard. Now, as these things go, when the work was finished and they remeasured the rock which was excavated, it came to 2,250 cubic yards, so the loss was staggering.
You might have to explain the difference between shillings and pounds here, you know.
Well, yeah, I don't think I want to go back to shillings, you know, but anyway, I'm sure you understand that 2 shillings is an awful lot less than £2.
Indeed.
But the architect, very decent sort of architects, some of them are, you know. He said, what we'll do is this, he said, we can see there's a problem. So we'll arrange for payment of the 750 cube, which was in the contract, at 2 shillings, and anything over and above that, between 750 and 2,250, we'll arrange for payment at the £2, you see, which is the going rate. Anyway, Parsons Morey were happy with this, but Dudley Corporation, public money and all that, they said, no, we're not happy with this at all. Where, for example, is the power given to the architect to change the rate? He doesn't have the power to change the rate. All he can do is to apply the rates in the contract, provided the work is of a similar character, executed under similar conditions. So the council objected to that. The contractor took the matter to court, and the lower court, they agreed with the architect. They said, well, it seems a fair and reasonable thing for us to do. And so therefore, the contractor won the case. Totally not happy, they go to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal went down the track of looking at why was the rate so low in the first place, 2 shillings. Why did he put it at 2 shillings? And they thought it might have been a bit of tactical pricing to get the job, hoping that when the work was completed there wouldn't be any rock. And so it was a question of why did you insert 2 shillings? Well, he couldn't contact the estimator, he'd perhaps run off with the MD's wife or something, we don't know where he went to. And so having gone down that track, the court thought that's getting us nowhere. We'll get back onto what the contract says, and rather like the Henry Boot case, read the contract, which says that the contract rates apply, provided the work is of a similar character, executed under similar conditions. So the contract rate is a contract rate. You might either make a killing or you might make a shocking great loss if you make an error.
But what's written in the contract is
Absolutely.
what the law
It's
says.
gospel, yeah.
Okay.
Independent Broadcasting Authority and EMI Electronics was heard in 1980 in the House of Lords. The case dealt with the question as to which party was responsible for the collapse of a 400-metre tall television mast on Emley Moor in Yorkshire. The collapse happened in freak weather conditions, and EMI Electronics, which designed and constructed the TV mast, claimed that it had no responsibility for the collapse as it had designed the mast using reasonable skill and care.
Well, EMI, Roger, there, claiming that the mast failed due to freak weather conditions. They couldn't have been foreseen. How did they get on in court?
Well, what the court said, they said if you were a pure designer, like an architect or an engineer, you could use the defence that you'd exercise reasonable skill and care. And despite exercising reasonable skill and care, you couldn't have foreseen the freak weather conditions, and therefore you have no liability. But the court said that would have been a good defence had you been a pure designer, but you're a contractor. And if there's no express obligation written into the contract, there'll be an implied term that what you produce is reasonably fit for its purpose. Because they said that your line of responsibility is not the same as that of the architect or engineer. Yours comes up the seller of goods. The idea of a seller of goods, if you, for example, with the hot weather, decide to go to a supplier of air conditioning units, and you say you want an air conditioning unit for your lounge, and you say leave it to you to perhaps suggest one. He suggests the Never Fail air conditioning unit which you take home. And it's an industrial type. It blows your curtains and bangs your doors. You take it apart. This is no good. I relied upon you to recommend a proper unit. And he'd be liable. He'd have to either give you your money back or give you a different unit. Well, contractors are in that position. In the absence of an express term, they have to produce a product which is fit for the purpose. And the TV mast lying in the field, in fact, it fell on a church. The TV mast lying on the church, it wasn't a Sunday, fell on a church, obviously is not fit for its purpose, so therefore the contract had a liability.
And are there any other authorities on this?
Yeah, there was a case a little earlier than that involving a company called Greaves and Bain and Meikle. The contractor designed and constructed a warehouse which had a suspended first floor. Job finished, seems okay. But the employee decided to run stacker trucks on this suspended first floor, and it collapsed. And of course the employer said to the contractor, well, design and construct, you should have produced a product fits for its purpose, and if the floor collapses, it's not fit for the purpose. And the contractor said, yeah, well, you've got a point, but when we entered into the contract, we didn't know that you were going to use this first floor to run stacker trucks. And therefore, our liability isn't what you say it is.
And was that a fair defence?
It was a fair defence. The court said it should be made known to the contractor when he enters into the contract the purpose for which the building is going to be used. If that's clear, then he has an obligation to make sure what he builds is fit for its purpose.
And are there any exceptions to this?
Well, what tends to happen is that insurance companies, they don't like insuring the risk of fitness for purpose. So the standard forms of contract, they don't have a fitness for purpose obligation where the contractor has a design and construct obligation. It has a lesser obligation of reasonable skill and care. So that's one exception. But when you get onto PFI, because insurance companies won't cover unless the premium is very, very high, on PFI jobs for things like big hospitals and big schools for the government, we're dealing with big contractors. And so therefore it's all passing down the risk, and the contractor doing the job takes all the risk, or as much risk as he can place on his shoulders, including fitness for purpose. It all goes in the price. The taxpayer pays anyway, so nobody cares, do they?
Well, I don't know. As a taxpayer, I care. Now, before we move on to our final case, yeah, I know. Before we move on to our final case, can you just clear up the difference for me? Because I don't think I've quite got it between fit for purpose and exercising reasonable skill and care.
Well, let me give you a little example. Many years ago, when I started in the dispute business in the early 70s, architects and engineers were specifying high alumina cement, sometimes known as cement fondue. It had the exciting quality, shall we say, of being quick drying, so it was very popular. But unfortunately, under certain circumstances, the cement deteriorated. There were quite a few buildings that had to be demolished partway through construction. I was with my hands, I thought there was plenty of work here for me, and I got absolutely nothing. Because the defence was simply this: when you're measuring whether you've achieved this reasonable skill and care, you have to show that your standard of service is the same as other people offering a similar service. So if you're all specifying high alumina cement, then it can't be shown that your level of service fell below that of the rest of people offering your service.
Because you thought it was fit for purpose, like everybody else.
You thought it was good enough, like everybody else. But if you were a contractor and your obligation was fitness for purpose, well, then you'd have a liability because the cement fondue was unsatisfactory. Don't make any difference what anybody else is doing. If it's a fitness for purpose, you've got to pay because the building has collapsed.
Roger, thank you.
Our final case is Victoria University of Manchester versus Hugh Wilson and others. Like the previous case, it centred on an allegation that the architect had specified the wrong material, in this case tiling and adhesive, for the job. However, the university also claimed there was an implied term in the contract that the main contractor was under obligation to warn the architect of any design errors.
So where does the blame lie here? Is it with the architect or is it with the contractor?
Well, the University of Manchester wanted a new facility constructed, and they appointed a local architect, Wilson and Womersley. They also appointed Poachin, who were a local contractor who'd done a lot of work on the campus for the university. And the architect, in drawing up the specs, included for imported tiles from Italy on the face of the building. They used to be known as the Italian stick-on tiles, but they became known as Italian drop-off tiles because they had habits of falling off. Anyway, they managed to identify the fault as being the adhesive. It was wrong, you see. Now, the first port of call from the employee's point of view was to sue the architect, but if you go to your lawyer and say, well, there might be one or two parties involved, who do we sue? Sue them all, they'll say, sue the lot, you see. So there was a suggestion that the contractor, if he was aware of a design fault, would have an obligation to draw attention to that fault. It's obvious, isn't it? If you happen to be a contractor, you receive drawings from the architect and they're wrong, you build it, you get paid. You knock it down, you get paid. You build it again, you get paid. That can't be right, can it? So they said, yes, there is an implied term that if the contractor is aware that there's an error in the design, he's got to draw attention to that error. But in this particular case, they said, well, it wasn't obvious, and the contractor would only identify the error if he looked very carefully through the drawings and the specs. And that duty wasn't there. He hadn't an implied obligation to look very, very carefully through all the drawings and the specs to try and identify errors. His obligation only arose when he was aware of the error. And so therefore, the principle was established, but in this case, the contractor wasn't liable because he hadn't the obligation to inspect the drawings and specs very carefully.
And this case was reviewed, wasn't it, in University of Glasgow and Whitfield and Lang. What happened there?
Well, in that case, the University of Glasgow built a new facility to be an art gallery. And when the work was finished, there was an ingress of water. And of course, water and works of art just don't mix, do they? And they managed to identify the problem as being a design fault. So, of course, the architect, Whitfield, was in the frame. But the architect, wanting to defend himself and deflect a bit of responsibility, said, well, of course, this was a design fault which should have been identified by Lang, the contractor, pointing back to this Manchester case. Well, the court looked at all this and said, well, looking very carefully at the Manchester case, the court there decided that the contractor would have a liability for identifying errors if he were aware of them, but only if there's a special relationship between the contractor and the employee. In that particular case, Poach had worked on the campus for years and they were buddy-buddies with the university. But they said up here in Glasgow there's not a special relationship between Lang and ourselves, therefore Lang don't have a liability. So they came to a completely different conclusion from what was decided down in Manchester.
How do they define special relationship?
Well, a special relationship, the court said, is very, very difficult to define. And they were more or less saying, this is what you have to show, but we can't tell you how to show it. Bit of work for lawyers in the future, you see, but they didn't define what was meant by special relationship.
So what does that mean as far as English courts are concerned? Because, of course, being Glasgow, the case was brought in a Scottish court.
Yeah.
Can English courts refer to it or not?
Well, they're not bound by it. The Scots do what the Scots do and we do what we do. But quite often they'll refer to it, just perhaps for a persuasion point of view. They would have said, what they did in this case, so we've had a case in Manchester where the court established that the contractor could have a liability if he didn't draw errors to attention of the architect. And then the Scots said, yeah, but that only applies if there's a special relationship. So they didn't follow the decision in England, but they were a bit persuaded, but they went off on a track of their own. So they're not bound, but sometimes they can be persuasive.
OK, Roger, thank you for that. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. I hope you're enjoying the entertainment here. But do keep an eye out for future programmes in our classic case law series. I'm sure you will after this one. For more information on this programme, please don't forget to refer to the study notes that accompany the programme. But for now, many thanks indeed to Roger. Until next time, goodbye.